Jeff is the owner of the Overhead Wire. The company's focus is sharing information about cities around the world with advocates, elected leaders, researchers, and other interested parties. Projects include podcasts, newsletters, and urban cartography and data analysis. Previous to the Overhead Wire, Jeff spent 8 years as the new media director and chief cartographer at Reconnecting America and the Center for Transit-Oriented Development, where we were kind of colleagues. He has a BA in geography and an MS in community and regional planning from the University of Texas at Austin. Please join me in welcoming Jeff to the stage.
All right, we're going to do a live podcast, and I want Alice Bravo and Chris Sinclair to come up here before we get started. Let's see, where's Alice? There you are, Alice. So we're going to sit down and have a conversation. No slides, so hopefully things go really well without them. I don't think we'll need them. Hey. All right. I'm going to sit down and have a good conversation. All right. How you guys doing today?
Great.
Good. How's everybody out there? Are you guys enjoying the morning? Good time? Yeah? All right, this is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I am Jeff Wood, and this is a podcast about transportation and urban planning. We've done almost 220 episodes over the last 5-6 years, and we're affiliated with Streetsblog USA, which is an advocacy organization focused on thinking about cities and streets in cities all over the country. So Alice Bravo and Chris Sinclair, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here.
So on the podcast, I tend to have guests introduce themselves, so we do a little background on folks. So Alice, can you tell us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
So I'm the Director of Transportation Public Works for Miami-Dade County. In that capacity, we're responsible for our 25-mile Metro Rail system, the 4-mile Metro Mover system downtown, our bus system, around 800 buses throughout Dade County, and we're also responsible for the surface transportation in terms of signals, almost 2,800 signals in Miami-Dade County, roads, pavement markings, and traffic control in general. I'm a civil engineer.
Have you always been interested in cities?
Well, I was fortunate, after working at the Florida Department of Transportation, I was the deputy city manager at the city of Miami. So in that capacity, you stop talking about projects in terms of individual accomplishments, but it's really, you're building a city and you're affecting people's lives and how they're going to have access to opportunity and mobility and livability. So working at the city really changed my perspective.
Do you have there was a lot of talk about superheroes this morning. Do you have like a superhero origin story? Were you a kid and you know, riding your bike to school or anything like that? What was like your origin of transportation?
I remember watching the Metro Rail being built, and I thought that was like we were Manhattan, because I'd watch Miami Vice and you'd see the tall buildings. And really the transformation from a development perspective that's occurred here over the last 10 years, you know, we've really become a major city, and you know, we're internationally recognized, and lots of people want to come here, and they do, and it's great. So we want to make sure that it's a place that can continue growing in this manner and still be livable.
Awesome. I love Miami. I've been here a number of times. The first time I think I came was in 2000 for spring break, so I'm sure a few of you have had that experience. Chris, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, been a planner for almost 40 years now. Started Renaissance Planning back in 1999, so it's 20 years. And when we started the company, it was to integrate land use and transportation, and I could go on for a while about that quest, and I'm still on the quest. I think the reason I'm here is I teach the transit-oriented development course for National Transit Institute, and what's been fascinating about that, we've been doing it for the last 5 to 10 years, and we get to go all around the country, seeing who's doing what with TOD. And we like to think that we're teaching people about TOD, but what happens is we learn just a lot about what's going on in different parts of the country. And it's just been fascinating.
And a lot of places are really different, right? They're all coming at it from different angles.
Very different. There are some common themes, but the way each region and locality and agency deals with TOD is unique to their circumstance and the issues that are at hand for them.
Outside of Miami, we're going to exclude Miami for a second because we'll talk about it a lot, but what's your favorite place to visit? From a TOD perspective.
You know, it's funny. I think I've been out to Seattle now 3 times teaching this course. And what's fascinating is I think they've got it probably as well as anybody in the country, but we still keep going out to teach the course. And they're doing a lot of very interesting things in Seattle. A lot of good planning, a lot of good implementation. So just out there this past summer, and you know, just some of the things that they've done with their bus system is fascinating. And
then what's your origin story? I have to ask this to everybody. Your transportation origin story.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. So when I was a kid, I go way back, and we had encyclopedias, for those people remember those things. And I rather than reading them, I would pull them out and I'd build cities with
books,
encyclopedias.
Like stack them up.
Stack them up.
Love that. I love it. So just a reminder, folks, we are doing the Slido thing, so we'll have questions at the end. We're going to leave a bunch of time, so you'll be able to ask questions at the end, so don't forget the Slido. And I should pull my phone out because I'm going to have to look at the questions in a second. But Chris, you've also written about cities as complex systems and been working on performance measures with the Federal Highway Administration. What have you learned staring into the big data vortex?
You know, it's interesting, the presentation about data. I mean, okay, so let me start by saying this morning when I flew in this morning to Miami International, and I'm debating about how to get here, so I'll pull out my phone and go to Google Maps, and it tells me you've got 4 or 5 options. What was fascinating to me was the quickest option was to either drive or to Uber in, and this is at 7 o'clock in the morning, which really surprised me. Transit, it was like 19, 20 minutes by Uber or by driving. Transit was going to be 54 minutes. If I took a bike, it was going to take 44 minutes. And if I walked, it was 2 hours and some to get here. And I'm looking at these different options, and I decided I will confess I took Uber in. I didn't take Metro, and even though I have a Metro Rail smart card, just because I needed to get some work done coming here. So I guess the point is this research that we just finished with Federal Highway Administration, and I could probably spend all day talking about it, so I'm going to get through this as quickly as possible. Federal Highway Administration realized when they came up with the system measures, performance measures for the FAST Act, that they were relying way too much on delay, and that they needed to come up with a multimodal system performance measure. So they hired us to do research for them, and what they wanted to do is take advantage of the data that are out there, and there's a lot of data out there. There are a lot of data out there. And they're not quite to where they need to be to fully operationalize the measure we came up with, but the measure that we came up with, we called it multimodal system productivity, and it's basically looking at the world rather than looking facility by facility, segment by segment. We're looking at complete trips. That's sort of the key thing that's going on with this measure. Complete trips from beginning to end, regardless of mode, regardless of travel path, complete trips. You're looking at how many of those trips are occurring on a given network at a given time, how long it takes those trips to be completed. And really, the simplicity of the measures, you take the total number of trips, you divide it by the total amount of travel time to make those trips, and then that gives you your productivity measurement. And it's a very different way of looking at the world, but it's looking at the world the way users look at the world, like I did this morning when I pulled out my smartphone, and sometimes it's not so smart, but I pulled out my phone and got information. So the data are there, and I can assure you that because I did a lot of research on data when we did this particular research, and Google has it. I know that Google has it. Getting at it from Google is going to be a real challenge because they have business models and privacy concerns. But the data are there.
We did something similar in California with LOS and VMT where we got rid of level of service as a measure, as a delay measure for building new buildings in CEQA. You can listen to level of disservice. It's an episode we have 2 hours long or something like that about that later on. So we could probably talk about this all day, but we want to talk about TOD. Alice, why is TOD so important for the Miami region?
Well, I think if you look at our history, the answer lies there. We were very fortunate. There was great planning that occurred here in the 70s, and our metro rail system opened in 1984. But really, at the time, there was not a lot of density or development planned around those metro rail stations. And what happened is that we had development occur west out in the suburbs, and that's why you have some of the traffic issues that we have today. So what we're seeing is that in the last 5 or 6 years, interest in transit-oriented development has really taken off. We have this wonderful system, and if we could get more people around it, the utilization of it would go up. So I think a lot of it started with a project called Brickell City Center. They, out of their own funding, spent about $6 million in developing a Metro Mover station into their development. And that was kind of like a cue to the rest of the development world that, hey, people are tired of driving an hour or an hour and a half from the suburbs. Maybe there's a market for this here. And suddenly, at one of our Metro Rail stations, a developer is planning 3 different towers, one with a 38-story tower, so 1,000 units at that one site alone. So obviously, this helps us address the biggest impediment to using transit, the first mile, last mile. If we can get people living around the transit and working around the transit, then those are vehicular trips we're taking off the road. So I think that'll go a long way for improving congestion, and fewer cars obviously helps improve pedestrian safety, which is a big objective for us as well. And at the end of the day, we're talking about, through our SMART plan, extending our transit system. The SMART plan is basically 6 corridors that are extensions of some type of rapid transit building off of the Metro Rail system. But obviously, it's a lot easier to build around the existing system than plan and fund these extensions. So if we can get this density model to work along the existing system, it bodes very well for the rest of the SMART plan.
We talk a lot about density. We also talk about, we put a lot of our hopes and dreams on TOD. We want it to fund our infrastructure. We want it to fund affordable housing. We want it to pay for the transit itself. Chris, what should we be measuring when we think about TOD, transit-oriented development generally? Because it's not just building buildings, but it's more than that.
Yeah, I think, in my mind, the T part of TOD is what we've got to keep in mind. Now, you can have, this is going to sound strange, OD without the T, nice pedestrian, walkable places, but transit is that mode that has to get money from somewhere. It's something that is subsidized, and typically the subsidy comes in just about every place with premium transit. It comes from a sales tax, just like Miami-Dade. And the more you can reduce that subsidy, the more effective the transit service can be, the less pressure that you have in sort of dealing with operations and all the cost of operations. So it comes down to, for me, it comes down to ridership. Putting together things in ways that are going to increase ridership. And as Alice just said, going back to the trip in from the airport this morning, you got to start thinking about these details when you think about transit. The reason why it was 54 minutes to get from the gate to this hotel was because first I had to take the people mover, to the intermodal center, the MIC, then Metro, and it was only 14, 15 minutes on Metro to get into downtown, but then I had to get on the downtown people mover to get over to here. So there's like 3 or 4 different steps I had to take, each sort of accumulated the time it took to get from the airport here. So, when it comes to transit, there are a lot of details that you have to work out, and I think the critical thing is, as you said, Alice, is structurally put things together properly. Get as many doors as close to the transit doors as you possibly can. And when I say doors, I'm talking about building doors, whether it's a home door or a job door. get those doors as close to the transit doors as opposed to car doors as you possibly can on either end of the trip. And that requires a lot of coordination between transportation planning, land use planning, developers. It just requires, and it requires a level of precision that I think planners aren't used to. And I think that's one of the key things that I've learned as I've gone around the country. Planning is not a very precise science, but when it comes to TOD, our level of precision has to start increasing because of these details that you have to pay attention to. So I implore when planners are out there doing what they're doing, start thinking like engineers when it comes to the detail of engineers when it comes to structurally putting together TODs properly and having them interface properly with the transit system. And then you get into the whole issue of operations, which is a whole nother level of detail, which I won't get into. But there's a lot of things that have to be worked out.
What do you mean level of precision? Like what does that entail?
Okay, so in a transit station area, you've got the transit station area, in the transit station itself. And there has been study after study after study that have shown the decay of ridership the further you get away from that station. So if you're a quarter mile away from the station, I think there's a 50%. These are, don't quote me on these numbers, but as you get, half a mile, quarter mile is the sweet spot. And as you get beyond that quarter mile, now you're getting into a real decay. It still comes down to getting those uses as close to the transit station on both the home end of the trip as well as the destination end of the trip. And so that means you're getting into a fairly precise level of land use planning and urban design as you're getting into the station areas.
And Alice, how does transit service play into this? We've seen places like, Chris, you mentioned Seattle. Seattle's invested a lot in transit service, and they've actually increased ridership, whereas a lot of cities have seen falling ridership and falling service. What does that mean for the development part if we don't have the transit part?
Well, I think to a large extent, in looking at this issue of what's happened to the transit ridership, a lot of the things that we point to is the issue of convenience. And as you pointed out, if because of the walking time and the transfers, et cetera, your cumulative travel time is large, you're going to look for a more effective way to make that trip. So I think people, when they look at their driving time, as development occurred west into the suburbs, they've seen that travel time grow. Maybe somebody who bought a house in the 90s out in the suburbs, their travel time was 45 minutes. Today it might be an hour and a half. So I think the developers are seeing that by building right at the stations, they can actually compete in terms of travel time and provide a travel time savings, and that's what's making that development product more attractive to people. So in terms of where we want to go with the future, we've actually worked very closely with our TPO and also looked at the land use around the new lines that we're planning for the SMART plan, and the former chairman of our commission, Chairman Bovo, led the charge to increase densities around the proposed lines, and so we're really taking a comprehensive approach of land use planning and the expansion of the transit system. But what's really an indicator that this expansion will be successful is that we're starting to see the interest and increase in density around the existing system.
What's the integration look like with the transit agency and land use agencies? What is the connection between the two?
Well, the transit department and land use are all part of the county department or county government. The interesting factor is that for maybe half of the county, we have municipalities that have planning and zoning control. But when the original Metro Rail system was planned, something called the RTC was created, a rapid transit zone, where the county would have jurisdiction, but working with the municipalities. So that way, the final product was something everybody could embrace.
And how much, so you're the head of the agency that was combined from streets and then also transit and transportation. How much has that combination helped over the last several years, thinking about all these integrations that happen around the county and the city?
I think quite a bit, because initially there were a lot of conversations of, well, one department has this idea, but someone in the other department didn't think that was in that department's best interest. And we had a lot of conversations where these issues came up, and basically I would ask the question, well, what's best for mobility? What's best for transportation? What's best for pedestrians? And just answering that simple question usually resolved the problem and led to a clear indication as to what to resolve. The other thing is that what we're looking for to improve both all types of transportation and transit is how we can use new technologies. So basically, infrastructure projects require sometimes years, a decade to plan and implement, but what we're seeing is that with technology, we can effectively virtually expand our capacity and improve our mobility. So for example, we have a 20-mile transitway, which are dedicated lanes for buses. This is our south corridor. It will become a bus rapid transit corridor. But today, we installed new technology, smart adaptive signals on that corridor. So our express buses, because of that technology, experienced a 25% time savings. So it used to take an express bus 67 minutes to travel those 20 miles during the rush hour, and now that's been cut down to 50 minutes, so 25% savings. So there are technologies that are bringing the transit and public work sides together and benefiting everybody. Now those smart signals are also going into traffic intersections, so they have transit signal priority, and also improving the flow of traffic, reducing the congestion. That improves our bus route travel times, so everyone's benefiting from new technology.
What about like basic technology, like street design? The cities, and what are you doing about street design and bus lanes and those types of things to speed up transit, to get folks from their development that's happening to where they need to go?
Yes. Well, we're working very closely internally. First of all, we're reviewing every roadway for opportunities for bus bays because we want to improve the user experience. We're expanding bus shelters throughout the county. But in terms of design, we're really focused on improving pedestrian safety and especially around the transit station. So, you know, we want to look at, for example, with our project, the Underline, we're working very closely with the Friends of the Underline, and this is basically a project that's going to take the 120 acres or so that exist under our Metro Rail system and turn it into a recreational area and a better bicycle facility. But the problem is that this crosses every major arterial in Dade County next to US 1, which are complex intersections. Some are state roads, some are county roads, and so basically looking at where people want to walk. Well, where are there trails in the grass, and trying to make those trips more direct so whatever infrastructure improvements we make are actually used. There was one intersection that before it received a pedestrian bridge, the marked path for pedestrians was actually to go down US 1, cross US 1, cross the side street, cross back again, and continue because there was a highway on-ramp, and that later was replaced with a pedestrian overpass, the most direct path. But for years, you could see there was a trail in the grass where people were actually walking in that direction anyway, despite the markings. So it's you know, looking at each intersection with a common sense approach and trying to find that balance between all the different modes.
Chris, how do we think about equity when it comes to transit and development? What are some of the things we should be thinking about when it comes to equity and making sure that everybody has a place in the discussion?
Yeah, I think, let me address that from the perspective of what planners need to be doing. At least what I think they should be doing, and this is, it has been done in different places, but you need to stay ahead of the games. So the transit investment typically gets made, increases accessibility to a certain piece of, a certain area. that accessibility starts increasing, demand for the property values go up, displacements start happening. So one of the things we stress, this is very important to the Federal Transit Administration, by the way. If you're doing a new starts application, you really do need to address affordable housing in a very comprehensive and thoughtful way. And to do that, you need to start thinking about partnerships, You need to think about coordination. You need to think about what the existing housing stock is in a particular place, what the stress on that housing stock is going to be as demand and housing prices start going up. And then come up with, there's not a one-size-fits-all kind of solution, but come up with different strategies for protecting affordable housing within these station areas, because that's one of the things you really want to provide within the station areas themselves, is good access to affordable transportation, which affordable plus quick transportation. So the trick is to plan. Do an inventory of what you have and plan for affordable housing and what your strategies are going to be with regard to affordable housing.
Excuse me. What about displacement? I mean, this is a big discussion as it pertains to transit lines and expanding transit. Is that something that you focused on in the past, and how can we look at that differently in the future from a gentrification and a displacement standpoint, making sure that communities have a say in what happens in their neighborhoods?
Yeah, I think, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Alice, in just a second, but I think, again, there's a lot of different strategies that can be used to deal with displacement or to address the problem of displacement. I could go down a list of things that could be done. One is setting aside a certain amount of the housing stock, and requiring developers to set aside units. The second is to go finding, one of the interesting places that we worked, or not worked, but we did a course out in Denver, and what they did was they put together this consortium of funding partners along a corridor. This is the corridor, I think it's the green line that goes out west from Denver. And they put together a consortium that raised money, and the money was used to purchase affordable housing or subsidize. It was either purchase affordable housing or to subsidize housing rents for people. And it was just, they built up an endowment, and the endowment is used to protect affordable housing. Brownsville here, it was a joint development exercise, and I feel like you probably can talk about it better than I can.
Well, we've had several projects that are solely for affordable housing, and we work with our sister agency in the county that provides funding, and those projects have been very successful. And then in the projects that aren't strictly set aside for affordable housing, we have county requirements in terms of the percentage of units that have to be set aside. But the greater picture that you're talking about, what happens outside of those buildings, I don't know that there's a solution for that yet.
In the Twin Cities between Minneapolis and St. Paul, there was a great communities collaborative, and they put together kind of like what you were talking about in Denver, where they put together a group of organizations, and the foundations got involved, and it was really fascinating to see over a 10-year period an organization that grew up and started thinking about the communities along the corridor. They even got the Federal Transit Administration to add 2 new stations where they had decided that it wasn't a good place because of travel time issues that they had in their model, and they got that changed. And it was pretty amazing that the organization grew up, they spent money on the corridor, they planned the line was built, and then the organization disappeared because it had done its job. And that's kind of a model, I think, for other parts of the country to think about. And obviously they have really good philanthropy and things like that in the Twin Cities region, but I just think that's a really interesting way of doing things. Is you start out, you're in, you're out, and then you're good. Do you have any examples of any good processes that have been used in the planning process for any of the corridors that you're going to plan to think about where they go, what they do, et cetera? Well,
I think what we're doing right now is actually working very well. between the Florida Department of Transportation and Miami-Dade County, we're spearheading the alternatives analysis, so basically developing the technology for each corridor, and the TPO is leaning the land use studies around each corridor. So you know, that way we're speaking to the public, but asking them different questions, and then we're collaborating with that together. And I think in our first corridor that moved forward to a decision-making point, which was the South Corridor. Back in August at the TPO, the alternative of bus rapid transit was selected. You know, the community engagement for that project was very important. There was a lot of debate in the community, should the alternative that be selected be rail? Should it be bus rapid transit? But in talking to people in the community, you start to see what was important to them. The reliable transportation was important. Something that would provide a time savings was important. And next, they wanted something that provided an investment in the community, something permanent that would help spur economic development. And so what we got from that was that the design of our stations was actually very important. So when they were shown renderings of robust stations that would work for BRT today, but would also work for rail in the future, and that the BRT would have all the same elements as rail, but at a fraction of a cost, so it could be implemented sooner than later. That resonated, and ultimately that's what was approved. So it's important to talk to people during that planning process and find out what's really important to the community.
And Chris, you've worked on a lot of projects, master plans and stuff. What's the importance of coordination that Alice was just talking about? And are there any good examples out there of really good coordination that's happened?
Yeah, in fact, we're working on the Kendall Corridor with the county. And it's been a fascinating process because we've looked at the corridor from a land use perspective, you know, focusing back on transit. There's been another consultant that's been working on the engineering side of the equation and coming at it from a different perspective. And what was fascinating about it was when we went out and did our public workshops and took our perspective and asked people to comment on how the corridor should get organized from a land use perspective around transit. One of the things that just fascinates me about people in general is that they're really good planners. You know, when you give them a problem to solve, and you say, okay, these are the tools and these are the things that you can use to do planning, they do some really good planning. So we got the public in our first workshop to plan the corridor for us, which they did, and they did a very good job and provided some insights that we hadn't thought about. Then we took that information back to the engineers, the PD&E people, and said, look, this is what they're thinking, this is, you know, and they also went out and talked to the public and got perspective from a transportation perspective about how things should be put together. And then we started comparing notes, and it all started coming together, you know, in this very nice integrated way. I think one of the interesting things we came up with was, for the BRT example, we didn't need nearly as many stations as the engineering analysis was dictating, because the public wasn't necessarily wanting that many stations. So it was just fascinating. And then we still have some steps to go through, but you know, just getting in a room together and talking through things from different perspectives, getting the community to weigh in from those differing perspectives, I think goes a long way in coming up with the right solutions.
Cool. Okay, so we've got about 15 minutes left. I'm going to go through some of these questions on the Slido system. The first one is, are there efforts underway to integrate multimodal options into one platform to provide one payment system that depicts total travel time and costs?
Yes.
This isn't a plant question, is it?
For the traditional fare card system in Dade County was the Easy Card, and about 2 years ago we transitioned to Easy Pay, and so now that's how you can pay for all your transit uses, and we're working to get that out on Apple Pay, Google Pay, and also working with different companies. What our goal will be for whether it's Uber or Lyft or a scooter rental, bicycle rental, to have that one integrated transportation payment system and one account. And that way, when you're planning your trip, we've eliminated some hurdles for you in terms of different modes. And we're also collaborating with Broward, Palm Beach, Tri-Rail, and even working with Brightline so that we could all be working off this one platform.
Cool. I know a couple of days ago that Berlin just started they have an app called Jelby, and basically it's all in one where you can hire any type of vehicle, scooter, bike share, car for hire, transit, anything you want. And so that just came out a couple of days ago. So that sounds like that sounds kind of similar.
And Carlos over there is working on a trusted data warehouse that will hopefully make all these companies comfortable in participating in this.
Good job, Carlos. Good to see you. The second question is, urban streets seem to be made of upper income or blight. How can we encourage middle-class street development or transform blighted streets into middle class? That's a hefty question.
I'm not sure. I mean, in terms of our streets, as in terms of appearance, we work for having landscaping on our streets, irrigation on all our streets. That's actually a county requirement that we put irrigation in when there's landscaping. But I think as we work, again, with areas where there's development occurring, we look for dedications for sidewalks, so sidewalks could be wider and improve that experience. I think a lot of what we do, we have to work within the right-of-way we have and the resources we have, but we try to improve the amenities as best we can.
Yeah, I think I understood the question, but I may not.
If you want to restate it in your own words, maybe, or
well,
what you think it meant.
Let me answer, and then I'll find out if I hit the nail on the head or not. The thing I think that seems to be missing from the equation is thinking about the transportation system as a system. That's all the streets that are out there, all the conveyances, all the transit. And if we can think, and the land uses, the doors that you have to get to. We on the transportation side of the equation, like pretend there's no doors out there. But there are doors, and there are places that people want to get from and get to. So if you can think of all that as being this big connected system. And one of the reasons we did the research for Federal Highway Administration, we actually worked for the management and operations, the TISMO group up at Federal Highway. All of the agencies were involved, all the divisions were involved, but they were the ones that led the parade. And what they were most interested in was resiliency, network resiliency. And for them, network resiliency was if something happened to the system anywhere in the system, there was enough resiliency in the systems, people had options to get from point A to point B and not be severely impacted by what's going on. So that's what they were looking at. But if you think about the network as being something that has to be both sustainable and resilient, then you do want to provide as many options out there as you possibly can. And so you want to put as much of the network in play as you possibly can at any given time. Now, if you start thinking about how you can balance travel through the network, getting from point A to point B, and there's a lot of ways you can set up the network to provide that balance, then you've got a lot of levers that you can pull and push and turn, in order to make these things happen. So I think, in my mind, what we've got to really do is we've got to not only think about sort of the structural side or the physical side of the network, but we also need to think about the demand side of the network and how that matches up with the physical side of the network, and hit it from that direction, and just understand. And with the big data that's coming out, and this is what's so encouraging about this MSP measure that we came up with the Federal Highway Administration, is now if you start looking at the world from a complete trip perspective, and you see how trips are sort of coursing through the system, then you've got more insight about how you design the physical aspects of the system, or where the connections are missing, or where you need to upgrade a street or downgrade a street in order to make that all happen. So I think we have necessarily fallen into the trap of looking at the system from a link by link basis because the data just weren't available. So that's not any accusation on anybody, but the world is changing in terms of how we can understand the demand side. We don't have to go look at each individual link. We can look at all of the trips as they're coursing through the system. And that's going to fundamentally change how we think about the system and how we design it.
It's pretty crazy with all this data that you have available. I mean, you have the cell phone information from where people are moving, because every person's phone is a little data tracker, for good or worse, for better or worse.
Yeah, so on that, I still have 9 minutes. I won't take long. So here's what's going on. So you've got cell phone coverage and that's got a little bit of accuracy to it, but not that great of accuracy. And the cell phone companies don't typically give you that information anyway. But what we have in most of the cell phones that are out there now is GPS technology, which is down to the not millimeter, but it's down to the inches and feet. And what's happening is people are, the app says, do you want us to track? They don't say, do you want us to track you? But they say, do you want to turn on your location? And when you say yes to that app, then it's picking you up every second and knowing exactly where. And I've seen these path traces that are created, and most of you probably have seen them too. But it's phenomenally accurate in terms of both time and location. And with that kind of information, right now the sample sizes are kind of small. Google has a huge sample set. That's why I said they've got the data. We know very precisely what's going on out there in the system. So the technology is there, and it's getting better and better and better, and the sample sizes are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so yeah, it's just the data are upon us.
Yeah, it can be a little creepy at times. I know that for me, I looked up to where to go on my phone on Google Maps, and then after I got off the bus, it said, "How was your bus ride?" And I was
That's
like,
right.
"What?"
And would you like a hot dog with that?
But just to build on upon what you said, something that we're embarking on is a redesign of our bus network. We have bus routes that cover the limits of the county, which is a huge area, yet, in some areas there's not robust frequency so we want to rethink based on actual data. Where are people going? Where do they want to go? Can we concentrate service in certain corridors and create that high frequency network and help people move around, and then find a different solution to get people to those high frequency corridors? Because if you look at where a bus route is, if people only within a quarter of a mile might be interested in accessing it, well then you have huge areas where no one has anything, any type of service accessible to them, and at the same time, in the area where someone could access it, you have only X percentage of people interested in using transit. So a pilot that we're gonna put an RFP out on the street for any day now is to create basically on-demand circulators. So app-based hail system with a flexible route, and that way we hope to feed people to our transit routes and hopefully build upon that to create our high-frequency network.
That's really cool. All right, so the next question is, data showed transit ridership was up with gas prices, was up with gas prices up. Should gas taxes be used to recreate this effect? What is the optimum point to benefit the community? These are awesome questions, by the way.
Many years ago, I heard someone say, we should do X to force people to use transit. And that sounds like along the lines of that question. And I think living in a democratic society where people, depending what they do while they're in office, they might not stay in office very long. I think it's important to not force people to do things, but to create products that people want to use. And then people will use transit because it's desirable and not because they were forced into it. And I go back to like all good things, the pendulum swings, and again, in terms of travel time and limitations of mobility, people are seeing that something's got to give. If we say no to every project, well then, don't complain about the issues we have because nothing's ever going to change. So I think that's why you're starting to see density around the metro rail stations, where 20 years ago, the surrounding community was totally opposed to it. if enough people are supporting an issue, that's how you can get that critical mass for something to move forward. And it's important that we do. When you hear people talk about why is congestion a problem, well, if you're spending hours and hours every day in your car, well then you have limited employment opportunities. Maybe you have limited educational opportunities. And at the end of the day, we're talking about opportunity, and that's what makes our community prosperous. So more and more people are affected by it. I think they're more apt to accept the solutions that are needed. And I'll tell people, people ask me, what are you going to do to improve congestion? And I said, I'm going to get you to ride the bus. And they're like, oh, no, not me. But at the end of the day, we're not going to get everybody to use transit, but if we provide convenient options that people see a benefit from, we'll get more and more people to use it.
So last question here from Malcolm Moyes, the city of Miami Gardens. Most of all new development in South Florida are mixed-use buildings with large parking pedestals. How do we improve the relationship between transit and land use regulations?
Well, I think this is another area. For example, in the city of Miami, they provide ways to reduce the amount of parking required for the building, and someone can actually pay into a transportation trust fund for that benefit. So you hear more and more about underutilization of parking because of the different ride-sharing modes that are out there. Ideally, we'd have a place where you wouldn't have to build structured parking for people's cars to sit there 8 hours a day. But right now, that when you talk to developers, the parking is almost like a requirement for them to get their financing. Yeah, so it's something that is starting to change, but there are other forces involved in it.
You know, I was going to say, one of the things we emphasize in the course is the fact that parking is something that's needed. You can't completely get rid of it. So let it evolve. Come up with a strategy that understands where parking can be temporary and move later. Strategy where the parking is going to be more permanent. But come up with an overall strategy of how you're going to meet that changing demand over time. So as you go into each station area, you've got to really think through the parking, because parking is a real critical aspect of this.
Yeah, and in some places they're actually starting to just leave some land next to the parcel fallow. I think it was in Charlotte. There was a developer on the south end that built a building, put the surface parking, and then waiting until there's no need for it, and then building a building on the surface parking. So if you don't do that structure, then you can build something later.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Well, Alice and Chris, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.